The town looked different when rain fell. Dust turned to mud, voices turned to whispers, and even the lamps along the street seemed to hesitate before throwing their glow across the darkness. On that evening, with water dripping from the eaves of shuttered stores and horses stamping in their stalls, Evelyn Grace walked with her small trunk clutched tight against her chest, her shawl pulled close though the wool was already soaked through. She kept her eyes lowered, though she could feel the glances on her. A few faces peered from under awnings, others pressed to window glass, and each one seemed to weigh her with the same quiet judgment. The girl who was left. The girl no one wanted. It had been only 3 days since her fiancé rode out and never returned. The banns had been read, the dress had been stitched, and the town's little church had been swept clean for the occasion. But he had vanished, leaving only dust behind him and a silence that was worse than a shout. By the second day, the whispers began. By the third, Mrs. Hargrove, keeper of the boarding house, allowed Evelyn to stay but muttered as she dragged a thin cot into the hall. "Some girls," she said under her breath, "just aren't meant for wives." Evelyn heard it. She heard everything. That night the cot creaked under her, and the walls pressed in with laughter from the rooms where couples settled into bed, laughter that stung like nettles against her skin. She pulled the quilt over her head, and in the quiet she whispered to no one but the dark, "I've never shared a bed. Never been wanted warm." Her voice trembled at the words, as if admitting them made them heavier. Days stretched into one another, each alike. She stitched buttons for a mercantile, mended a rancher's torn coat, and sat on the porch with a thimble on her finger, working under the sun until her skin burned. Coins clinked into her palm, barely enough to pay Mrs. Hargrove for board. The rest of the town avoided her except for the sideways glances, and each glance reminded her of the dress folded at the bottom of her trunk, still white, still waiting, now nothing more than a shroud for what she had lost. The only time the air shifted was the afternoon she saw him. Caleb Hart stood in the general store, shoulders filling the doorway as though he carried the weight of the land itself. His hat brim shadowed a face that had weathered too many suns and too many winters. He did not speak at first, simply waited as the storekeeper loaded flour and salt into his sack. Evelyn, holding her basket of mending thread and needles, tried not to stare, but the silence around him was different from her own. Hers was the silence of shame. His was the silence of choice. When she struggled with her parcel, an armful of flour that tipped dangerously, he moved without a word, catching it with one steady hand. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she felt seen, not as a spectacle for gossip but as a woman who existed, solid and whole. Then he turned and left with his sack over his shoulder, boots striking mud, and the door swung shut on the scent of rain that followed him. Behind her, 2 women leaned near the spice shelf, their voices sharp enough to cut. "That Hart fellow. Cold as stone. Buried his wife 10 winters ago. Never spoke more than a handful of words since. Wouldn't look at a woman twice." Evelyn's fingers clenched around her thread, but inside she felt a flicker of recognition, pain recognizing pain. She watched through the window as he mounted his horse and rode out of town, his form shrinking into the dark line of the horizon. The days resumed, the hours stitched together like uneven seams. Evelyn tried not to hope. She told herself she had no right. But little Lila, the neighbor's orphaned girl who often hovered by the boarding house, began to seek her company. A child of 8 with tangled hair and curious eyes, Lila tugged at Evelyn's hand one morning and whispered, "Come see." She led her down the street to where Caleb stood beside his horse, crouched low as he mended the strap of a small broken doll Lila carried. His hands were rough, calloused, built for reins and rope, yet they moved with surprising gentleness as he threaded twine through the cloth and tied it firm. He said nothing, only patted the doll's head before handing it back. Lila beamed, hugged the toy close, and darted away. Evelyn lingered at the edge of the street, uncertain. He glanced up once, eyes unreadable, and in that glance there was no judgment, no pity, only a mirror of silence that matched her own. She lowered her gaze quickly, heart thudding, and hurried back before anyone could see her watching. Evenings grew colder. The boarding house felt smaller. More strangers came through town, and Mrs. Hargrove, never one to refuse coin, filled every room and even the hall with cots. One night Evelyn returned late from a sewing order, rain lashing her shoulders, to find another lodger asleep on her cot. Mrs. Hargrove blocked the stairwell with crossed arms. "Try the stable," she said flatly. "You're not the only one needing a roof." Evelyn stood there dripping, shawl plastered to her hair, the eyes of strangers on her again. Shame burned hot under her skin, hotter than the rain was cold. She turned away before they could see the tears rise. The street was nearly empty, only mud and shadows and the thrum of the storm. She clutched her trunk tighter, not knowing where her feet would carry her. The answer came in a flicker of lamplight. Far down the road, past the black outlines of fences, a single glow burned steady in the distance. A cabin window. A place where warmth still lived. She knew without asking whose it was. Her shoes sank into mud as she walked, each step slower, heavier, but she did not stop. By the time she reached the ranch gate, rain had soaked her through, and her hair clung to her cheeks like dark ropes. She hesitated at the door, knuckles hovering, breath sharp in her chest. It was foolish. What if he turned her away? What if he saw her as the rest did, unworthy, pitiful, unwanted? Still, the rain beat down, and she could not turn back. Her hand rose, trembling, and knocked. The door creaked open, and lantern light spilled over her like a benediction. Caleb stood framed there, tall, the shadow of his hat casting his face in half-darkness. He looked at her without speaking, only the quiet sound of rain between them. She felt her throat close, words lost, shame threatening to swallow her whole. He did not ask why she had come. He did not demand explanation. He only stepped aside, his hand brushing the door, his silence steady as stone. Evelyn crossed the threshold, her heart pounding louder than the storm, and the door closed behind her with the finality of something she could not yet name. The cabin smelled of smoke and damp wool, the air close with the faint sweetness of wood still drying from the storm. Evelyn stood just inside the threshold, her shawl dripping onto the floorboards, her trunk still clutched as though she might be turned out at any moment. Caleb set the lantern on the table, its circle of light catching the hollows of his face, the gray at his temples, the worn edges of a life lived mostly in silence. He neither asked nor pressed, he simply waited, the steady patience of a man accustomed to long winters and longer grief. Her voice would not come. The only sound was the fire's soft crackle and the hammering of rain on the roof. Her body trembled, not entirely from the cold. He crossed to the hearth, lifted a folded quilt from a chair, and held it toward her. She hesitated, then accepted, wrapping the heavy wool around her shoulders, feeling for the first time in months that she was not entirely invisible. Caleb pulled another log from the stack, laid it carefully on the flames, then turned back. His expression remained unreadable, carved more from habit than from intent. He gestured to the chair nearest the fire. Evelyn obeyed, setting her trunk down by her feet. When she lowered herself into the chair, its solidity beneath her seemed a miracle. He busied himself with the kettle, filling it from a jug and placing it close to the flames. The smell of damp earth clung to her dress, and the heat slowly drew it away. She pressed her hands together tightly, unsure of what he expected, unsure of what she might offer in return. After a long silence he set a tin cup before her, steam rising from its surface. Coffee. She sipped and closed her eyes, the bitterness grounding her, the warmth burning a path down her throat until it reached her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw from disuse. He nodded once, returning to his chair opposite. They ate bread and beans without ceremony, each mouthful plain, each act of chewing loud in the small room. But something in the quiet filled her more than any feast could have done. Here there was no whispering, no sidelong glances, no judgment. Only the hum of rain and the slow rhythm of his presence. The quilt slipped from her shoulder as she set the cup down. Her fingers twisted in the fabric of her skirt, the words bursting before she could stop them. "I've never shared a bed," she confessed, so low it might have been mistaken for a breath. The moment it left her lips, shame scalded her, and she dropped her gaze to the table. Silence stretched long. Then she heard the scrape of his chair. She braced herself for pity, for dismissal, for the hard edge of truth spoken too plainly. But instead he said, quiet as the fire, then share mine forever. She looked up sharply, sure she had misheard. His face held no trace of mockery, no flicker of hunger. Only the plain offering of a man who had lost much and understood what it meant to give what little remained. Her throat closed, and tears pricked her eyes, but she swallowed them. He did not move closer, did not press her. He rose, crossed to the bed at the far end of the cabin, and with deliberate care lifted the quilt folded at its foot. She recognized it as a woman's work, delicate stitching, faded but tended with reverence. He set it aside, opened a trunk, and drew out another, plain but new. Spreading it across the mattress, he stepped back as though to show her the choice was real, that he made space not from pity but intention. She remained by the fire, heart pounding, until he returned to his chair, settling into the shadows as though nothing had shifted. Only when exhaustion overcame her, heavy as the storm outside, did she rise. She walked the length of the cabin, each step echoing in her ears. At the bed she lay down fully clothed, drawing the plain quilt to her chin, eyes fixed on the dark rafters above. She expected his weight beside her, but when she turned her head, he still sat by the fire, boots planted, hat on his knee, a silent sentinel against the night. At last her body slackened, and she slept. Morning came pale, light spilling through the single window. She woke to the smell of bacon crisping in the pan and the sound of boots on wood. Caleb glanced back once, then turned his attention to the skillet. She sat up slowly, gathering herself, uncertain what she was now, guest, burden, promise. He placed a plate before her with simple finality, and she ate as though the act of chewing might anchor her in a world she did not trust to hold. When he hitched his wagon later, he did not ask if she would come. He only looked at her, and she climbed up beside him. The town was already stirring, wagons rolling, children darting across the street. As they passed, whispers rose like smoke. Moved in with heart already, has she? Shameless. Evelyn felt her cheeks burn, her hands twisting in her lap. Caleb did not look at them, did not speak. He only reached across the worn wood of the bench and laid his hand lightly atop hers. The weight of it was steady, anchoring. She breathed out and let her fingers remain beneath his, not gripping, not pulling away. They finished their errands in silence. She felt the stairs burn, but for the first time she did not crumble beneath them. His stillness was shield enough. That evening, when they returned to the cabin, the air carried the scent of wet pine. Evelyn stood by the bed again, the same tremor in her hands, the same uncertainty. Caleb set his revolver aside on the table, turned the lamp low, and sat at the edge of the mattress. His voice was quiet, almost reluctant, but each word landed firm. No one's going to run you off here. The words broke something inside her, the dam she had built against years of rejection. Tears slid down her cheeks, hot and unstoppable. She crossed the small space between them and let her head rest against his chest, the thud of his heart steady under her ear. He did not move to claim her, did not tighten his hold. He simply let her rest, a silence more eloquent than any vow. Days bled into one another, but the rhythm shifted. She mended curtains for the windows, stitching with quiet care. She planted flowers by the steps, their green shoots fragile but defiant. When she poured water from the tin pail, she felt the earth drink greedily, as though grateful for her touch. Lila came often, skipping up the path, laughter spilling through the cabin like light through cracks in the door. She called them Mr. and Mrs. Hart, without pause, without question, as if naming them might make it true. Evelyn blushed each time, but Caleb never corrected her. And still the town whispered. When Evelyn rode in for thread or flour, eyes followed. But she no longer lowered her gaze. She carried herself straighter, the knowledge of his quiet loyalty like steel beneath her skin. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, she stood at the threshold of the cabin, watching him at the corral. He moved with a patience born of solitude, steadying the horse with a touch, murmuring words she could not hear. For a moment she saw him not as the silent widower or the man hardened by loss, but simply as Caleb, the one who had offered her a place not of charity but of belonging. The air smelled of dust and wild grass. She stepped down the path, her heart pounding, unsure of what she might say. When he turned, she froze, caught in the depth of his gaze. He tipped his hat, nothing more, but in that gesture lay the unspoken truth. He saw her, he accepted her, he claimed her without a word. She felt the future stretch before them, fragile yet unbroken, like the first green of spring pushing through frost. That night, lying beneath the plain quilt, she did not tremble. She turned to face him, her voice barely audible in the dark. "Thank you." His reply was nothing but a steady breath, yet it filled the room like a vow. And in that silence, Evelyn understood, she was no longer the girl abandoned, no longer the whisper on strangers' tongues. She was part of something enduring, something quiet but immovable as stone. The storm outside had passed. The air smelled of earth reborn. She closed her eyes, resting not only in his cabin but in the knowledge that sometimes the truest promises were the ones never spoken aloud.